Hey everyone, welcome to Reflections, the wisdom of Edgar Cayce. We're coming to you courtesy of our broadcasting partner, moretalk.tv. Joining us today on the show is Dr. Jim Tucker. Jim is a Bonner-Lowry Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia. He is continuing the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies with children who report memories of previous lives. His first book on the research, Life Before Life, a scientific investigation of children's memories of previous lives, has been translated into 10 languages. His most recent book, Return to Life, Extraordinary Cases of Children Who Remember Past Lives, tells the stories of recent American cases. His website is jimbtucker.com. Dr. Jim Tucker, thank you so much for joining us on Reflections today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And I wanted to start off, you've written and spoken extensively about the scientific case for reincarnation based on what you've found through your research over the years. Can you briefly summarize this research for our listeners?
Sure. This is work that's been going on at the University of Virginia for over 50 years now. And it started with Ian Stevenson when he was chairman of the Department of Psychiatry here. And he became interested in reports of children from various parts of the world who said that they remembered past lives. And what he did was he would go and investigate each case, find out exactly what the child had said, and find out if the child's statements matched somebody who actually did die. Over the years, we've now studied over 2,500 cases, and some of them really do offer quite impressive evidence that there is this link between the past life and the current one.
Right. And how did all this work get started for you? I know you had a private psychiatry practice, and I understand that you gave that up to kind of pursue this research full time. What was that decision like for you?
Yeah, well, that's right. I trained here at UVA, and I heard about Ian Stevenson then, but I never met him. And I thought his work sounded kind of interesting, but that was as far as it went. And I was actually in private practice for 9 years. I continued to live in Charlottesville, where the university is. And particularly when I got married, my wife was interested in such things, and it got me curious enough to start reading up on them. And eventually I called the research office to see if they needed any help with their studies on a volunteer basis. One thing eventually led to another, and I came on half-time and then full-time back in 2000. And as far as what went into the decision, I thought that the approach that Ian and the others here were using was really appealing, where it was a very scientific, analytical kind of approach to this question of the possibility of survival after death. And I think most of us certainly wonder about the possibility of surviving after death. And to be able to explore it in a reasonable scientific way, I thought was really interesting, and I've really enjoyed the work here.
All right. And can you tell us a little bit about what you found in some of the cases? Maybe give us some examples of some of your cases that really stick out in your head.
Sure. So as far as what we find typically a pattern. These are very young children who start talking about a past life, usually around the age of 2 or 3 when they start. And some of them will describe being deceased family members, but others will talk about being strangers in other locations. And if they give enough details like the name of that location, then people have often gone there and found that, in fact, somebody did live and die whose life matches the details that the child gave. These children, along with their statements, often show a lot of behaviors that seem connected. One thing we have found is that most of the children describe a life that ended either early or ended violently, an unnatural death. 70% of them are unnatural death cases. And a lot of those children will show a phobia toward the mode of death. So, for instance, there's a little girl in Thailand where from the time she was born, she hated being in water, and it would take 3 adults to have to hold her down to give her a bath. Then once she got on to talk, she described being a girl in a nearby village who had drowned in an accident. What I have done is focus on American cases over the last few years, and they are harder to find here, but they're also more interesting in the sense that they don't have the potential cultural influences that the ones in Asia do, because there, most of the people believe in reincarnation, whereas here, of course, most of the people don't. And what we found is that most of the parents of the American cases, they did not believe in reincarnation until their children started making these statements. You asked about an example, and one that is well known is James Leininger. His parents eventually wrote a book about their experiences, but he's a little boy in Louisiana with Christian parents who, around the time of his second birthday, started having horrific nightmares of a plane crash, where he was kicking his legs up in the air and screaming, airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out. And then during the day, he started taking his toy airplanes and saying, airplane crash on fire, and just slamming them nose first into the coffee table over and over again, to the point that the table had dozens of scratches and dents in it. And then he also taught some about these nightmares, saying that they were memories that he had had from his last life. He said that he was a pilot and that he had flown off of a boat. His dad asked him the name of the boat, and he said Natoma. He said that he had been shot down by the Japanese, that he had been killed at Iwo Jima. And when his parents would ask him his name, he would always say me or James, which at the time they didn't make anything up. One time they asked him who else was there, and he said Jack Larson. Well, eventually, his father, who initially was very opposed to the idea of past lives, said he started investigating James's statements just to show there's nothing to it. But eventually he learned that, in fact, there was an American aircraft carrier called the USS Natoma Bay that was stationed in the Pacific during World War II. It was involved in the Iwo Jima operation, and it lost one pilot there. So we know if James Leininger was talking about someone from that ship, it had to be that one guy. And in fact, his name was James as well, as James Houston. His plane crashed exactly as James Leininger described it, getting shot in the engine, bursting into flames, crashing into water, quickly sinking. And the pilot of the plane next to his on the day he crashed was named Jack Larson. I got involved when James was 12, so he was older, but the father had saved all the research he had done, and I was also able to get documentation, not just that James's statements matched with this pilot, but documentation of his statements that was made before the pilot was identified. So we know that there's no sort of wishful thinking putting the fit together, but all the things that I've just reviewed with you are things that we have definite documentation that James said and did before Houston was identified, and it all seemed to fit. So that was really a case that provides very strong evidence, again, that there's this carryover from a past life into the current one.
Right. Wow, that's wonderful. And what would you say to the skeptics? Because I know they're out there who try to debunk you and say that, maybe the parents are planting this into the kid, or what has it been like dealing with that backlash?
Well, certainly there are cases where we consider that, and it's more likely in places where there's a strong belief in reincarnation, and if the families are feeling a particular loss with a family member, then sure, it certainly is a possibility that they kind of overinterpret things a child says and may impose this identity onto the child. But then you've got a case like James Leininger where none of that happened.
Right.
Where the parents didn't know what the heck he was talking about, and certainly had no wish to impose a past life identity on him, and yet all his statements fit for somebody who had lived a long time ago and lived far away. As far as dealing with the backlash, for the most part, we don't have a lot of direct interaction. I mean, people leave all kinds of nasty comments on websites, obviously. But I just, for the most part, avoid reading the comment sections, so I avoid it that way. And,
Right.
in academia, I mean, I'm sure that there are plenty of people I interact with here who think that this work is pretty goofy, but most of the time they don't say that to my face. And I think I earn people's respect with the other work I do here, with the clinical work, seeing patients and so forth. So they just sort of let me be with the research, and it works out for everybody.
Right, absolutely. And what is here, hold on, sorry about that. How did you where did the cases come from, and how do you go out and find these kids? What's the process that, did they come to you? Are you actively seeking out all these children and their families?
Well, with the Asian cases over the years, Ian had associates who were looking for cases in the various countries, like Thailand, Sri Lanka, India, Burma, places like that. And they would hear about them either through word of mouth or sometimes through the newspaper. And then they would let Ian know. With the American ones, of course, there's not a whole lot of word of mouth because here families don't tend to talk about it much. So we have to essentially depend on the families to find us, which of course with the internet it's quite easy to do these days.
Right.
So if parents have a child who's talking about a past life, they Google past lives or children or whatever, and then fairly quickly they find us. Um, we would certainly like to continue to hear from American parents when their children are saying these things. So I would welcome anyone to contact me, and I'd be happy to give them my impressions of what their children are saying.
Absolutely. And how has this research and being involved, really immersed in this research, changed your opinion about reincarnation?
Well, certainly being in this field now for nearly 15 years, I have become more impressed that there is more than just physical reality, that there is a realm of consciousness or mind that is separate from physical reality and is more than physical reality. As far as reincarnation itself goes, um, certainly I think we now have good evidence that some children do have memories that came from a life in the past. And the most obvious way of understanding that is through reincarnation, but that's certainly not the only possibility. And people in our field, in parapsychology, will debate both this and mediumship and other types of things where it may be not quite what it appears, that the children somehow have access to these memories through some sort of paranormal or parapsychological process, but not that they actually lived the things that they seem to remember. I think that is a bit of a stretch, and I think with the best cases, the best explanation is that they are actually remembering a life that they lived.
Right. And what sort of things are these kids saying that you're using for your research? What type of things are coming up about their past lives?
Well, most of them talk about things that happened near the end of the previous life, and three-quarters of them will describe how the previous person died. And they'll also tend to talk about events from near the end of that life, or people for that matter. So if a child is remembering the life of an adult, he or she would be much more likely to talk about a spouse or children than to talk about parents. So it's as if the memories have just sort of picked up where they left off in the last life. Many of them will get emotional as they talk about these things. They will miss the previous people. Sometimes they may be angry, especially in cases where the previous person is murdered. They may express a lot of anger toward the killer. Um, and we have also found that even with the children who may show great emotion, usually by the time they're 6 or 7, this really tails off and often stops completely where the children don't say anything about it. In fact, many of them seem to forget all about it. If there's contact between the two families, that sort of keeps it going longer. But it does seem to be a pretty time-limited phenomenon that these children are going through.
And is it pretty common that the children are reborn into the same family? Is that something that occurs often in your research?
Yeah, it's a minority of cases, but it's certainly we've got several hundred of them.
Right.
And it really varies. There are also cases where the child may describe somebody from the same village or from very nearby, not necessarily a family member. But then we've got the ones like James Leininger, where they're describing a complete stranger from some distance away. So it really varies. Now, obviously, the stranger ones, ones involving strangers, are ones that are of the most interest to us as we're trying to determine what the evidence is for a connection with the past life. And with the ones with stranger cases, we know that in many of them, we know that the child did not overhear, so did not learn about these things through normal means. But the children almost always, with some exceptions, but almost always describe a past life in the same country. And again, it's often fairly close by. So it does seem that with many of these kids, if it is a past life that they're recalling, that they still have quite a tight connection to that life, both emotionally as well as, you might say physically, in the sense that they're usually reborn and fairly close by.
Right. And in going through your research, I noticed there seems to be a theme of an abrupt or violent death that's associated with this past life. What did you find that having to do with? Was there some significance there?
Well, there certainly seems to be. As I mentioned before, 70% of the kids die by unnatural means, meaning murder, suicide, accident, in combat. And even with the ones who die a natural death, they tend to die quite young. In fact, even with the natural death cases, a quarter of them are under the age of 15, the previous person was when they died. So there does seem to be something about dying young or dying violently that is part of this process. Now, there are exceptions to that, but it seems much more likely in those cases than somebody who just lived to be an old age and died peacefully in their sleep.
Right. Absolutely. Jim, we're gonna take a quick commercial break, but we'll be right back to talk more about Jim's groundbreaking research here on Reflections: The Wisdom of Edgar Cayce. And welcome back to Reflections: The Wisdom of Edgar Cayce. Today on the show we have Dr. Jim Tucker, and we're talking about his research on reincarnation. Jim, I'm wondering, did the kids ever talk about what happens in between lives? Do they ever recall those memories?
About 20% of them do. So most of them never say anything, but then we have the ones that do, and it can vary. Some of them talk about earthly events where they hung around after the previous person died. Sometimes they talk about the previous funeral that the previous person had. There's one little girl in Thailand that Ian studied where she made a lot of statements, but one thing was she complained that her ashes had been scattered rather than buried the way that she wanted them to be. And it turned out that the previous woman, she had wanted her ashes buried under the bow tree of the temple complex where she studied. But when her daughter went to bury them, the root system of the tree was so extensive that it was impossible to do so, so she scattered them instead. And then there are kids who will talk about going to other realms like heaven. In fact, the American kids may use the word heaven. James Leininger, who I talked about earlier, he talked about going to heaven and meeting people there who had been shipmates of his. And then he talked about, as some of the kids do, being led to or choosing their next set of parents. Sometimes they'll talk about seeing guides that lead them to their next family. Others, the kids just seem to sort of find the next parents on their own. Some of these descriptions at times can sound a little fantastic, but they're certainly interesting. And occasionally there are cases where they give verifiable details, like the ashes being scattered, or in James's case, he one day told his father that he knew he'd be a good father when he picked him, and said how he had seen his parents having dinner on the beach at a big pink hotel in Hawaii, and decided that he wanted them as his parents. Was turned out that his parents had, in fact, taken a trip to Hawaii and had stayed at a big pink hotel, and the last night had dinner on the beach. And that was when they began trying to conceive. They didn't actually, his mom didn't get pregnant for another couple months, but that's when the intention was created to have a baby. And according to James anyway, that's where he found him.
Right. That's amazing. And I understand also that you found a significance with birthmarks or certain markings on the body of these children. Can you tell us a little bit about the significance of that?
Yeah, those are cases that were really interesting to Ian. Even before he got into this work, he was very interested in psychosomatic medicine, the interplay between mind and body. And with these, that interplay seems to have even crossed lifetimes. So these are kids who were born with birthmarks or birth defects that match wounds, usually fatal wounds, on the body of the previous person. And when he could, Ian would get autopsy reports. If he couldn't do that, he would talk with eyewitnesses of the body after the person was killed to make sure that, in fact, they do match the child's birthmarks and birth defects. Some of the birth defects, frankly, are quite grisly, like a little girl who remembered a man who got his fingers chopped off as he was being murdered, and she was born with markedly deformed fingers. Ian documented 18 cases where the children were born with two birthmarks, ones that matched both the entrance and the exit wound of gunshot victims.
Oh, wow.
He wrote a book called Reincarnation Biology, which is 2,000 pages long, and it has over 200 of these cases in them. And some of them really are quite remarkable, and they offer tangible physical evidence of this link between a past life and a current life.
Right. And I know you talked a little bit about how these children tend to forget things as they get older, maybe to 5 or 6 years old. Well, but how does it affect their life as these things are coming up and the family is dealing with this whole dynamic? How are the children affected by that? Is it a long term, or is it just something that they kind of wipe out as they get older?
Well, it can be very difficult at the time, both because of the child's distress and the distress that causes the parents. And sometimes it causes conflict.
Right.
Even
Right.
in places like India, with a strong belief in reincarnation, a lot of the parents try to stop the children from saying these things, sometimes using rather harsh tactics to try to get them to stop. Those don't seem to make any difference, although the children tend to stop anyway. But while it's going on, it really can be quite intense, and for some of them, for the parents to keep hearing every day, "You're not really my parents. My parents live in such and such place," it gets quite trying.
Right.
Long term, however, these kids seem to do fine. Um, One of our colleagues, Erlander Harrelson, recently did a study where he went to Lebanon and Sri Lanka and talked with adults who had been studied when they were children, studied as cases with past life memories. And for the most part, they were doing quite well. And at that point, a fair number thought overall it was helpful to experience that it did often give them more of a spiritual outlook, that they could see that there was more than just the day-to-day life, but because they had these memories of surviving from another life.
Right. Absolutely. And what advice do you have for parents if their children at a young age were to start talking about past lives? Is this, I know it's probably something that is happening, maybe even more so now than ever, but what would you tell a parent who's dealing with this type of stuff? Because I know it could potentially cause conflict.
Yeah, I think, especially with the American parents, it can be kind of jarring because they're certainly not expecting their children to say these things. I think it's helpful for parents with anything their children say to be open to it, not necessarily overly encouraging necessarily, but to be respectful of what children say. And we don't encourage parents to ask a lot of questions about it. For a couple of reasons. One is that the child can then feel pressured about it, but two, the child can start just making up answers. But it's
Right.
certainly reasonable to ask, what else do you remember? Or if the child is describing a traumatic death, to sympathize with that. But then to more or less follow the child's lead. And if the child is in the mood to talk about it, then let them talk, and then other times just let them be a typical child. We can let them know that this is not a sign of mental illness. I mean, we've done psychological testing with a number of these kids, and they can be quite intelligent, actually, but otherwise that they tend to be fine. And I think as long as the parents are supportive, then the children will get through it, even if it is nightmares or difficult statements, and then usually by the time they're starting school, they're doing just fine and moving on.
Right, absolutely.
I know one other thing I would ask parents to do is to make notes of what their children say, because if the children do start giving enough details where their memories can be verified, then we would certainly love to hear from them. And having that written documentation really can be crucial in the strength of the case. But parents are welcome to contact me at any time. The easiest way to get to me is through my website, jimbtucker.com, and there are links there to leave me emails.
That's great. And do you have a steady flow of emails coming in to help your research?
Yeah, I mean, it varies. At times they can come in waves a little bit, maybe after there's some publicity about our work. But
Right.
yes, we're hearing from parents all the time. Now, with the American ones, often we will hear where the child hasn't necessarily said anything verifiable, but just the fact that the child's talking about a past life at all, of course, is really striking to the parents, and they get in touch with us. The ones that we're most interested in, of course, are the ones that have the potential to be verified. But we're actually interested in hearing about all of them, yeah, especially with the advent of the internet, where it's so easy for people to find us. We really do hear from a lot of parents.
Oh, that's great. And do you see this? Do you see your research as kind of bridging the gap between science and spirituality? Because I know that's a topic of discussion for a lot of people now, how there seems to be this new research and this new interest in topics that are really helping to blend together science and spirituality. How do you see your research playing a role in all of that?
Well, we certainly always try to take a scientific approach to this material, which obviously is spiritual kind of material if we're talking about past lives. Um, and yeah, I mean, I guess it is a connection between those two worlds, and um, there are certainly people who accept their beliefs on faith, and that's fine. We wouldn't challenge that, but we think there's more than one way to come at this area, and for us, it means looking at it carefully and methodically, and seeing if there actually is evidence to support the beliefs that many people have.
Right. And as a scientist, personally, has it changed your opinion on reincarnation?
Well, like I was saying before, it certainly made me more impressed that there's plenty of things that we still don't know, and that
Right.
there is more. I do think there's more than just the physical world. I think looking at quantum physics and other areas of research like mediumship or like near-death experiences, there is evidence that consciousness needs to be considered separate from it. And with that being the case, for our children, it appears that the consciousness has continued on after the physical brain died, which makes sense if consciousness is separate from the physical world. And then with our kids, it seems that it has come back and inhabited a new brain in a new body.
Right. And what would you say to somebody who would argue that the population explosion that we're seeing and continuing to see rules out reincarnation? What would you say to somebody who said that?
Well, that it doesn't. If there are plenty of people who have died in the past enough where we could all have had past lives. One estimate I saw, and this is probably a conservative estimate, is that there have been 105 billion people who have lived on the planet Earth, and of course now we're about 7 or 8 billion. So there are plenty from the past. Now, with there being more and more people, it would mean that the interval between lives would have to be shortening. People would have to be coming back quicker. But there's certainly no reason to think that just because there are more of us that we couldn't have past lives.
Right. And do these cases for you mean that we all reincarnate? Is that something that you're hoping to determine?
I don't see that we could determine it from our cases. And I'm not convinced, even if you accept these cases, that we do all reincarnate. I mentioned earlier that the past life tended to be exceptional in the sense that the previous person died violently or died very young. Now, otherwise, the kids tend to talk about very ordinary lives, but that part of it is not ordinary. And it seems to make at least intact memories, intact past life memories, seems to make them more likely. Now, of course, it could be that we all reincarnate and we just don't have the intact memories. But I think it's also possible that consciousness could have all kinds of experiences in other realms or other worlds, you might say, beyond just this life here on Earth. And I don't see why consciousness would have to be limited to this life on Earth, which would mean that we wouldn't all necessarily reincarnate in the sense of coming back here, but just that the consciousness would continue in another form.
Right. And what's the feedback been on the two books that you've written? Has it been good? Has it caused a bit of controversy for you, both personally and academically?
Well, the feedback has certainly been good generally. A lot of people have written me that they enjoyed the books. Personally, I feel more satisfied with the second one, Return to Life, than the first one, Life Before Life. Life Before Life, my first one, was basically an overview of what's now 50 years of research. And I did offer little brief summaries of a lot of really interesting cases. But with the new one, Return to Life, I really tell the full story of some quite interesting American cases. So I personally am more satisfied with that. Professionally, people have been tolerant of this work for a long time now, and the university has always been tolerant of this work, and the books certainly haven't changed that. And I do hear from other scientists or other physicians saying that they've read the books and were quite impressed by it, and sometimes share stories from their own families. So altogether, it's been quite positive.
That's wonderful. And Jim, we're going to take another quick commercial break, but we'll be right back with more from Dr. Jim Tucker here on Reflections, the Wisdom of Edgar Cayce. Welcome back to Reflections, the Wisdom of Edgar Cayce. Today we're talking to Dr. Jim Tucker. He has written a number of books on reincarnation. We're talking about some of the cases that he had gone through in his research. And I was hoping, Jim, that you could tell us maybe one or two more cases of ones that really stick out in your mind that help to support your research.
Sure. Well, along with James Leininger, another American case that has really impressed me is a little boy named Ryan. And both of these are in my Return to Life book. But Ryan is a little boy in Oklahoma who started talking about a life in Hollywood. And he would cry about missing that life. And his mom, when they went to the library, got a couple of books on old Hollywood to see if seeing landmarks would bring up more specific memories so that he could deal with them better. They're going through one of the books, and he stops, and there's a picture from an old movie, and he points at one of the guys and says, hey, that's George. We made a movie together. And then he points to another guy in the picture and says, and hey, that's me. I found me. Well, it was a picture from an old movie called Night After Night, and George Raft was the first person he pointed to, who was a movie star back in the day. But the other guy he pointed to, who he said he had been, it turned out had no lines in the movie. So it was impossible for the mom, the caption didn't include names, it was impossible for the mom to tell who that was. So she wrote to me to see if I could help identify him. Well, that was going to be a hard task for me. But eventually, with the help of through the work of a Hollywood archivist, we were able to identify who that man was. Meanwhile, Ryan is making all kinds of statements about his life, and his mom is sending me emails sometimes on a daily basis about everything Ryan is saying. So Ryan said how he had danced in New York, and then he had gone to Hollywood, he had been in movies, and then he had worked for an agency. He said he had seen the world from big boats and been to Paris. He said he had a big house and swimming pool. And all of this seemed quite unlikely to me that an extra with no lines in a movie would have had this extravagant life. But it turned out that, in fact, he had. The man that he pointed to was eventually identified as a fellow named Marty Martin. And Marty Martin, in fact, had danced on Broadway. He then went to Hollywood, where he worked in movies, and then started a successful talent agency. He went to Europe on the Queen Mary. In fact, we saw eventually connected with his daughter, and she had a picture of her parents in Paris. Ryan had said that he had a big house with a swimming pool, and that the street address had the word rock or mount in it. Marty Martin did have a big house with a swimming pool, and it was on Roxbury. So this is another one like James Leininger, where the child made some really specific statements, and they matched with somebody who had lived quite some time ago. Marty Martin died in 1964, so he died 40 years before Ryan was born, and in a completely another place and time, and it seemed impossible that Ryan could have learned all this through any sort of normal means. It took us a lot of work to be able to learn it at all. So there did seem to be this connection that had carried over from Marty Martin's life.
Wow, that's incredible. And I'm curious for our listeners, what exactly does all this research and these cases that you bring up tell us about life after death? And what does it tell us about the nature of consciousness and memories? What have you found so far?
Well, it looks like there are cases where not just memories, but emotions can in fact survive after somebody dies, because we see memories and emotions in these children that seem linked to this past life that they're recalling. Regardless of whether the rest of us have intact past life memories, which most of us don't, they are certainly evidence that memories and emotions can survive death. And again, the experience that other individuals have may be very different, but at least we have this evidence that there is this continuation, that physical death, death of the brain and death of the body, the physical death does not have to be the end. And in fact, we have evidence that it's not the end with these cases.
Right. And I wanted to talk a little bit about your upcoming talk at the ARE. Is this your first time speaking at the ARE?
No, I spoke a number of years ago, but it's been quite a while.
Okay, great. And it's actually, the conference is entitled Many Lives, One Soul. It's a reincarnation, life before life, and your soul's plan. It's from September 26th through the 28th here in Virginia Beach. And your presentation is entitled Return to Life, Extraordinary Cases of Children Who Remember Past Lives. And can you tell our listeners a little bit about what a conference attendee would expect to get from your lecture?
Sure. And I know that I gather a fair amount of the conference is going to be experiential, but my part is not. It's just my talk. But yeah, I'm talking on Friday night, and for a couple of hours I'm scheduled for. And a fair amount of it is just going to be covering the different facets of the research. So I've got pictures of the birthmarks and various cases to talk about, and going over the various details that we see in these cases. But then I'm also going to try to look at the bigger picture. And this may be a little challenging, but I'm going to bring in some quantum physics and try to demonstrate that there is good reason to think that consciousness, again, should be considered separate from the physical world. And then that will lead to my attempt to put this all together in the sort of a vision of what life afterlife, what the afterlife is like, and what perhaps we can all expect once we do die.
Right. And you mentioned quantum physics, which to me is something that always sparks off a light bulb. It's something that I've done a bit of research into quantum physics and how it does help to bridge the gap between science and spirituality. But in you mentioning that, can you tell us maybe a brief idea of how quantum physics plays into this for somebody who is not familiar with that idea?
Yeah, and not to wander too far into the weeds on it, because of course it does. It's quite a complex area.
Right.
But very briefly, so the take-home message of much of quantum physics really is that observation is critical to, on the quantum level, meaning the smallest level of the universe. Um, Observation is critical to events even happening. That
Right.
before they're observed, they're merely potentials, and then it's observation that creates an event that creates reality. And it's not just people like me saying it, but even Max Planck, who was the founder of quantum theory, said that in his view, consciousness was fundamental and that physical matter was derived from it. Because if you see that observation is necessary for events to happen, then there has to be something making the observation. That is not that it's consciousness that the physical reality grows out of. That really consciousness is primary and the physical world is secondary. And then if that's true, then that leads to a completely new view of life, really, and leads me to speculate about what would happen when we die, when we leave this physical body, and yet the consciousness continues. And if we accept the idea that the physical world grows out of consciousness, then it may give us clues about what other kinds of realities may grow out of consciousness as well.
Right. And do you see this idea of consciousness, this topic of potential research, do you see a growing interest in it amongst community of maybe scientists and scholars that you come into contact with? Is this something that's really taking off, or is it just no more than it's always been researched into?
Well, I don't know that I'd say taking off exactly, but there's certainly a lot of interest in it.
Right.
And I think, it's something that quantum physicists have sort of hinted at for a long time now. But it's so hard for the rest of us to kind of wrap our heads around some of the stuff they talk about. That I think scientists in other fields have tended, frankly, just to ignore the findings that reality is not as it seems. But yes, I think more and more people are taking a look at it. There are more and more books that physicists have written for the general public trying to explain these findings, and I think they do sort of naturally tie in with the kind of work that I'm doing to persuade us, if we're persuadable, that there is more going on here than just materialism, just physical matter.
Right. Absolutely. And you building on the shoulders of Ian Stevenson's work, and do you see your work being built on in the future? What role do you see it playing in the field that you're currently in?
Well, that I find very hard to predict. I mean,
Right.
the field of actually exploring, investigating these cases, it's a pretty small field. There are a handful of us who are doing this. I think our findings can stand the test of time, and I think starting with Ian, where his documentation was so incredibly specific, then that data holds up and people can explore it through the years. If other areas of science like quantum theorists, if they eventually conclude that consciousness should be considered separate and where it's accepted in mainstream science, then I think a lot more people will then turn to our work and for evidence of what consciousness in fact does when it is released from a physical body.
Right. And I'm curious, just personally, coming from a scientific background and being a scientist, how did you first get introduced to the Edgar Cayce readings or the ARE?
Well, um, that's hard to remember. I think
Yeah.
it was either high school or college. I think it was high school, actually. One summer where probably I just saw a book at the public library that interested me. But I did read a couple of Edgar Cayce books, and I confess I'm not an expert by any means, but it is convenient. The ARE, of course, is so close. I mean, it's 3 hours away. So it's an area that I probably don't know as much about as I should, but it's certainly what I find interesting.
Jim, I was wondering if you could just share one more case maybe that sticks out in your mind with us before we wrap up the show here.
Well, with most of our cases, the child is, other than how the previous person died, the child is recalling a completely ordinary life of somebody who lived and died and was not famous by any means. But I've got a couple of exceptions that are interesting, and one is a little boy where when he was 2, he got a set of plastic golf clubs, and he just loved them. And one day when his dad was on watching TV, just going through the channels, they passed the golf channel, which his dad wasn't a golfer, he didn't even know they had. But the kid got all excited and then would insist on watching the golf channel. And he eventually said that he had been Bobby Jones, who was for people who are old enough to have heard of Bobby Jones, who's quite a famous golfer back in the 20s and 30s. And his dad gave him some tests, which he was able to pass. Like he showed him a bunch of different houses, and the little boy pointed out the picture of Bobby Jones's house and said home. And there was another one, a picture of some old golfers, and the little boy pointed to one and said, "That's Harry Garden," and it turned out it was a guy named Harry Barden. So there were some impressive parts of it, but the most impressive part is that this kid was essentially a prodigy in golf. The local golf club typically would let kids take lessons by the time they were 5. And in his case, when he was 3, they let him start because he had such a natural swing. And he has continued to have quite a swing that I remember the dad sending me a video when he was 5, and it was remarkable that a 5-year-old was playing that way. And he has become quite a good golfer. He's still young, but in junior golf tournaments, at one point he won 21 in a row, and he's won a lot more than that altogether. So it's a kid where really the most impressive part of the case is the talent that he shows, and we've had other examples like this too, where some of these kids seem to have skills, or at least an ability to pick up skills that seems connected to the past life, and that seems to be the case for this young man.
That's great. Wow, that's awesome. What a great story. And I love you sharing these cases because these cases really, it gets your mind thinking, differently about things, and you can pay attention. You can find a lot of stuff not only, within yourself that could possibly be linked to past lives, but it's good to be aware of that so you can point that out in other children and help people to, kind of bring this to the surface.
Well, that's right. Of course, it's great for me that I get to meet these families and explore all these details with them, and it's really quite extraordinary.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for doing what you do. And of course, thank you so much for sharing it all with us today on the show. It's been an honor to have you on. Thank you so much.
Well, it's been real fun talking to you.
Absolutely. Dr. Jim Tucker, thank you so much for joining us on Reflections.
Thank you.
Dr. Jim Tucker will be a featured presenter at the headquarters conference, Many Lives, One Soul, Reincarnation, Life Before Life, and Your Soul's Plan. This is from September 26th through 28th, and is here in Virginia Beach at the ARE headquarters. Jim's presentation is entitled Return to Life, Extraordinary Cases of Children Who Remember Past Lives. To register for this and other conferences at the ARE here in Virginia Beach, You can visit our website at edgarcayce.org/conferences. Don't forget to pick up Jim's books and learn more about his groundbreaking research at jimbtucker.com. On behalf of everyone here at the Association for Research and Enlightenment, I'm your host, Brenton Bickerstaff, reminding you to come visit us here in beautiful Virginia Beach. And of course, check out our website at edgarcayce.org to get a look at all the free activities we have going on here at the ARE. Thank you so much for listening, and have a wonderful week, everybody. Now it's time for the Thought for the Day. And joining me today for the Thought for the Day is again Dr. Bill Austin. Bill, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
My pleasure, Brent. I'm happy to be back. Thank you.
Good to have you, of course. And if you can go ahead and read the Thought for the Day, that'd be great.
This comes from reading 830-2. There are no shortcuts to knowledge, to wisdom, to understanding. These must be lived, must be experienced by each and every soul. You know, I think a lot of us will spend time looking for the essential key, whether we find it in a book or from a reading or a psychic source. You know, how can I get that enlightenment right now? You know, what are the things that I can do to bring it forth so that I don't have to keep mucking around in this day-to-day life? And I like this reading because he says there are no shortcuts. You know, it's application. And the Cayce readings really give us a number of ways to apply this knowledge. It'll give us pointers on what we can do, but it's always a reminder. It's a moment-to-moment experience. And it's really attuning our will with the divine will. And when I say attuning our will, I think it's more of being open and receptive to that divine will and apply what comes through us in whatever we're doing, whether it's talking to another individual or performing a physical task, that every moment counts. And it's our attitude and our connection with that divine will that really makes things right.
Absolutely. That's great. Yeah, I love this because the last sentence he says, these must be lived, must be experienced by each and every soul. And what I like about that is, of course, what you talked about, the application is where you find the truth. The truth is found in the application. But it also says each and every soul. I kind of take that as everybody does have a separate path. So what's going to be your truth? What you find out through the experience of applying these spiritual principles, that's going to become your truth, and it's going to be unique to you. I think that's great because in order to find your unique path, you have to apply what you've learned. You can't just, like you said, go out and find these little bits of knowledge in a book. Until you apply them, you don't really start to get the karmic lessons and see the patterns work out, which is, you know, obviously can only happen in the application.
Yes, I really agree. You know, we do have that unique individuality. You know, we have our personality, and Cayce talks about this, the difference between our personality and our individuality. You know, our individuality is still connected with the divine, you know, that really connects our oneness with each other. But our actual expression is going to be unique for us. And it's tailored around what we've learned in the past and what we're learning now. And the more open and receptive that we can be to an inner guidance, I think the faster we start to manifest this.
Absolutely. I think the key word there is open and receptive, because so many times we get blocked off from things just from our own mental patterns. And if you do stay open-minded, especially, it's incredible the experiences that can come your way, that can manifest in your life.
Yes. Yes. I
Absolutely.
agree.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today on Thought for the Day. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
My pleasure. Thank you, Brett.
Absolutely.